We'll kick off the debate with an interdisciplinary panel, having two economists and two political scientists working in the subfield of international political economy. And the question is both vexing and Lenin-esque, if not Leninist. How did this disaster happen and what has been done about it in the past tense, not in the present tense? We have four speakers and four aspects of transnational actors of relevance for the current dynamics of finance. We're going to have a presentation on looking at central bank networks, a public form of transnational agency par excellence, followed by one on cross-border banking networks and flows. Then the third on the transnational economics and politics of too big to fail, and finally the regulatory regimes proposed by commissions set up before the central banks and the usual suspects stepped in to regulate finance. We're going to go alphabetically, and our first presenter, Martin Carstensen, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Business and Politics at the Copenhagen Business School. His research agenda focuses on regulatory reform in the financial sector, special resolution regimes in finance, and the political power of economic ideas. Martin published his work in New Political Economy, Political Studies, European Political Science Review, and introduced to political economy the term bricolage or hybridization as an alternative to policy paradigm, a long-entrenched concept. Martin, you have the floor.
It's called institutionalizing bailouts, special bank resolution regimes in post-crisis financial regulation. It deals with a set of policies that are becoming increasingly popular in the international financial regulatory debate, and it's basically that's the special resolution regime policies. The basic idea of them is to make the closing down of banks more efficient and to avoid that taxpayers foot the bill for resolution. But maybe it's also an institutionalization of bailouts. So one of the major problems during the financial crisis is, of course, the too big to fail problem. That we have a number of large institutions that, if they fail, they basically ruin our economies and ruin the financial systems. So there are at least three major issues in the too big to fail problem. That the big, large financial institutions, they carry large systemic risks for the states, for the sovereigns. We've seen numerous examples of that during the crisis. The too big to fail problem is also a matter of distortion of competition. So it's easier to be a big bank than a small bank, even though these big banks carry so much risk compared to smaller banks. And finally, the too big to fail issue undermines the legitimacy of the system altogether because of these first two issues. So it's no surprise that the too big to fail problem has taken up a lot of the attention of policymakers and transnational policymakers as well. And so far we've seen basically three categories of solutions. The first category is structural reform of different kinds. We've seen proposals for caps on size of banks, breaking up big banks, ring fencing proprietary trading from more normal plain vanilla consumer lending and so on. It's not a lot is happening there. There was the Volcker rule in the US. We have seen the Vickers Commission in the UK, and there's also the recent Liikanen report from the EU that are all discussing these structural reforms, but it's not really amounting to a lot of real structural reform. A second line of solutions is tougher capital requirements for systemically important financial institutions. And that is most prominently seen probably in the Basel III Accord. But it's not a really, well, one could of course discuss if it's enough. It's about 1 to 2.5% extra in capital requirements for for systemically important financial institutions, but it's there anyway. The final line of final category of solutions is the so-called special bank resolution regimes. And considering that the two first sets of solutions have not really, they haven't been very strong. They haven't really, the first line of solutions is really not getting a lot of political traction, and the second one is not amounting to a lot. So it's really natural to turn to the final solution here, the special bank resolution regimes. Okay, normally you would, or during the crisis, a lot of the regulators and a lot of the states handled failing financial institutions by using normal corporate bankruptcy law. Or rather, they tried that with Lehman Brothers, and it didn't go very well. It was a so-called disorderly liquidation. A lot of people would argue, a lot of economists especially would argue. The problem with normal bankruptcy law is that it's basically set up to protect creditors rather than than general financial stability and the public as such. You use, in corporate bankruptcy law, you use mechanisms like automatic stay or reorganization and the absolute priority rule. So it sets certain limits on how you can liquidate or how you can resolve a failing financial institution. It also moves quite slow. There we have certain cases throughout financial history where banks have been resolved during a periods of 10, 20, 30 years even, before they were finally settled. And time is of the essence, of course, in financial crises. So people have argued, economists and policymakers generally argue that bankruptcy law is not really useful in resolving a financial crisis. Others, especially some legal scholars, argue that it is, but I'm not going to really go into that discussion here. But the aim of putting up these special resolution regimes is to avoid bankruptcy and the disorder that follows from that, and bailout, which is basically the other solution in a financial crisis. Another important aim, or maybe the central aim of a special resolution regime, is also to protect financial stability. It's to avoid that taxpayers end up paying for resolution as well. And this useful to avoid that it's thought to be useful anyway, aimed to be useful to avoid that any financial institution is too big to fail. Okay, so to be more specific about what a special resolution regime is, you could argue that it contains different combinations of these three categories. First, we have preventive measures. Perhaps the most important preventive measure of a special resolution regime is a commitment by the authorities to close down a financial institution of any size. If the financial sector, if the big players really believe that they will be closed down, the idea is that they will keep from their risky behavior that otherwise came from being too big to fail. A second preventive measure, and there's been a lot of debate about these so-called living wills. It's basically a plan for how a failing financial institution can be resolved in an orderly way. So it gives regulators an overview of what the company actually contains and what are its business lines and so on. Those are the main preventive measures. Second, we have early intervention powers. That is basically that our authorities are mandated to intervene before the point of insolvency. And this is an important difference from normal corporate bankruptcy law, that with these enhanced special resolution measures, you can go in before you and resolve an institution before you can in normal bankruptcy law. You can also bypass shareholders, which is quite important, and there was a number of problems with that during the crisis, that shareholders postponed the resolution of these banks because it was in their interest, obviously. Lastly, we have resolution powers, and they come in different numerous different forms. We have subsidized mergers, or it could be where basically two institutions, an unhealthy and unhealthy institution, go together, and maybe it's subsidized in some form by the industry or by the regulator. We could also imagine that a regulator sells part of a bank to a competitor, or to a healthy institution, and the different kinds of useful mechanisms here. So that's a special resolution regime right there. Okay. So of course an important question is if it's powerful enough, if these special resolution regimes are actually effective in avoiding the too big to fail, or solving basically the too big to fail problem. And well, we don't know, because it hasn't been used. It's been used in Denmark, but that's a different story. But in the U.S., it hasn't been used yet, the new special resolution regime that I'll be talking about in a moment. But we could speculate that that even though the authorities have these enhanced powers, it's not necessarily easy to, or even possible to, resolve these large financial institutions without a lot of instability and so on. Why is that? Well, the banks are getting bigger. They're even more too big to fail now, in terms of size anyway, than before the crisis. And that naturally follows from one of these strategies, namely of mergers between normally a failing institution and a big bank then, who has the capacity to take over another bank. Okay, banks are not getting less complex. Actually, with a lot of the new regulation coming out, banks are only getting more complex probably. They still borrow a lot, obviously. They're highly leveraged. And politicians and regulators, well, it's still difficult to remove the punch bowl when the party gets started, as a right there. It's regulators notoriously forget previous crises, and why would that change the next time? So there's room for skepticism here. So I was thinking, as a political scientist, why are they then doing it? Why are everyone talking about these special resolution regime as basically the solution to too big to fail? Well, it gives more power to the state, more power to the authorities in handling a bailout, or handling, well, these crises. So I'm thinking that it's if it cannot solve too big to fail, it can smoothen the process of bailouts. It can give authorities enhanced powers in a future bailout. And it does that in multiple different ways. It gives, as I've already mentioned, these things that a special resolution regime normally contains. It gives enhanced intervention power for the state, so it can move in earlier and have more control with the situation. That does not necessarily mean that they are successful in resolving a failing financial institution without bailing out the creditors, for example. But it makes things easier for them nonetheless. In a lot of these resolution regimes as well, it's possible to actually bail out the creditors under certain circumstances. It's also possible to nationalize banks as part of these special resolution regimes, for example, in the UK. So what it's interesting with these special resolution regimes that they were put up to make the process of resolving a large financial institution more orderly, when in fact it's becoming less and less clear how you actually do it, because there are so many choices for the authorities on how to actually put together a resolution. It also provides the authorities with more discretion in deciding what to do, and less judicial review than in normal bankruptcy law. Okay, one short example on a special resolution regime is the American one. As part of the Dodd-Frank Act. The basic idea one of the basic ideas of the Dodd-Frank Act was formulated quite clearly and boldly, I think, by Obama when he said that it's supposed to put an end to taxpayer-funded bailouts. I think probably it's important to underline the taxpayer-funded part. It does not necessarily mean an end to bailouts altogether. but that's discourse. So if we look at the Dodd-Frank Act, it's a huge set of policies there. It's like 2,000 pages or whatever. It's huge, but it generally bypasses structural reform and it does not set out to tax these large, systemically important financial institutions. Actually puts a lot of faith instead in the special resolution regime that is part of the Act. It covers all institutions that are believed to pose a threat to financial stability. So authorities do not have to point out exactly who they will resolve using this regime. They can simply, they can make the argument that a certain institution is a threat to financial stability, and then they can use these policies. It is a bit of a complex process of actually starting this resolution process, because the Treasury and 2/3 of the Fed and the FDIC boards have to agree that this is actually the case, that you cannot use normal bankruptcy law, and that this institution is a threat to financial stability. So they have to agree on that. It's called the three keys turning process by some scholars. But when they do agree, or in the case they would agree, within 24 hours, a court is petitioned, and within 24 hours it has to decide if there's actually a basis for starting this resolution process. If the court feels that is too short a period of time, 24 hours is pretty fast, to look over the books of this financial institution, actually determine how much liability it is to financial stability. Well, there will instead be an administrative decision that to go ahead with the resolution, and the court procedure will then move on. But the resolution process will be started nonetheless. Okay, and then finally the FDIC is appointed receiver. And why is this not necessarily a goodbye to bailouts? Well, it actually gives the FDIC some interesting possibilities of bailing out creditors. It can decide that it can bail out certain creditors if it is deemed necessary to uphold financial stability, and if it maximizes the estate of the receivership, as it's called. That's a pretty big if, and that's a pretty big loophole, so to speak, in bailing out creditors. So, of course, shareholders will be wiped out, as they usually are, but certain creditors can still be bailed out. One way of doing that is to move one set of creditors to a bridge bank and leave other creditors behind. And that way, it's also possible to break the absolute priority rule that the same class of creditors should be treated equally. The FDIC does not necessarily need to do that here. And industry-funded bailouts are still possible, and across-the-board lending facility that is really aimed at one institution could also be put up. So a goodbye to bailout maybe we'll see. I'm a bit skeptical. Okay, so just some short conclusions. To make this is obviously it's difficult to prove the first statement, but I would make the argument still that you need certain structural reforms to make special resolution regimes credible. If you simply accept the banks are growing bigger and bigger and more complex, well, it's not credible that you can actually resolve these institutions without major consequences for financial stability. And if you look at Dodd-Frank, for example, that's not really, well, it opens for the possibility of bailing out these creditors. So maybe there's an acknowledgement of that in the Dodd-Frank Act. But you could also think of, so the question is, are the financials, are the big players winning again? And is the state a loser here? And I would argue that it seems like the state, as in the Obama administration and the regulators generally, are, well, basically accepting the too big to fail problem that it's there. They're not really trying to break up the big banks. They're not really trying to solve this problem, but they are trying to get greater flexibility in the resolution process and greater powers in putting down these companies in an orderly way. Bailing out in an orderly way is what I would expect to happen. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.